Oh, goody.
All right, what is going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we are back with another episode of Meta Monday. So it has been 2 weeks between our Meta Mondays here, as is usual, and we have a lot more data to look at. Before, not a whole ton of time had passed between the new patch and the when we kind of like looked at the data, so the sample sizes were a lot smaller. Now we've had this patch for about a month now, and even though there are some things that we still have relatively little data for, like Chi, we do have a I think better overall picture of what the meta is kind of shaping up to be like currently. So we're going to take a look at some comps here that I've been, playing quite a bit of that I think have all been, pretty decent performers in the current meta. And then we are going to get into our graph and take a look at that and see how it looks different than the last time we looked at it. Spoiler alert though, frost comps are still everywhere, as you can guess by the title. So we are going to look at that, but first we're going to take a look at the decks I have here. Before we get into it though, if you enjoy this type of content, do remember to like and subscribe. It really does a whole ton to help out the channel and keep the Mercenaries videos coming. But without further ado, let's get into it. Again, I really would like them to give us more than 9 deck slots. I think 9 is rather limiting, but we've got 9 decks here, so we're going to go through each of them, talk about it a little bit, and then we'll get into the graph. So, this one is one I've had in my, rotation since before this most recent patch even hit, and that is the Frost Multi-Opener. So this is, Frost Valera, so you open with your Belinda, Varden, Valera. We are running the Death Rattle on Varden, mainly because I swap up opens with this comp quite a bit. So because of that, you do kind of want this here. If you're mainly opening with these 3, you can just get away with using Bandit Frost, and it can be very good. But we all know the strategy by now. We're speeding things up with our Belinda, getting the Elemental to go fast with Valera, and then you're snapping people and snowballing the game with Varden. One important thing to note about the strategy, obviously if you're opening with this lead, it can be a little weak to Grom. Basically, anytime you're running a Valera strategy, if you have only one enabler to combo her, you can sometimes have some problems with Grom. The nice thing about this, though, is the opponent in that position has to make a choice between, do they want to mess up our combo by hitting Belinda, or do they want to stop our freeze by hitting the Elemental? And most of the time, I think you're going to see that they do end up going for the Elemental instead, because the freeze is really scary, unless they also have like a lead Ragnaros or something. Yes, we got the Water Elemental equipment on Belinda, definitely the best for most of her builds. Valera has her Unnatural Smoke. And so our bench here, we do have Rag, Localar, Jaina. And this is still one of like my favorite of the older comps because I just love the flexible openers, and it really feels like you have game against pretty much everything with these kind of openers, where you can just like totally pivot if you think they have a counter for your, Valera opener with Varden and Belinda. You can say, well, I'm not going to do that at all, and do like a Rag Localar open or a Frost open with Jaina, Varden, Localar, stuff like that. It's really interesting, and I do kind of enjoy that strategy a lot, and that's one of the reasons I kind of like this comp. And just your standard equipments on the next 2 here with Frigid Winds on Localar and Ice Block on Jaina. So yeah, that comp was really powerful in the last meta. It's still really powerful in this meta, so if you're looking for a versatile Frost comp to mess around with, I recommend that one. Next up, we have Surjak Orc Nature. So this one is a really sweet build that I love playing a lot. I've played a lot of orcs in the past, And I was a little sad when the kind of Frost meta first came in, and it felt like it was just shutting down a lot of the orc strategies. Sadly, I still think there is not like a great build with Garrosh, which is an orc I really did like playing with, but maybe he'll come back in the future. But for this build, we do have an orc lead, so we do have Grom, Galvangar, and Sarafang. And the nice thing about this is Galvangar gives a pretty big buff to attack. Also, Frightening Shout is an insane ability. There have just been times where you shut off like some crazy stuff, like Valera's skill 1, Longjin's ability to either swap or to basically deal damage when he gets hit. It's just people are spamming their good abilities as much as possible. So the fact that you can just turn them off 3 turns, especially if they're going fast, which a lot of the metagame is revolving around going fast still, it really makes Galvangar a pretty worthwhile unit. And then Sarafang is here to scale up our orcs, especially with his Serenite Stompers. +7, +9 is nothing to scoff at, and these orcs get really big really fast. The other cool thing about this comp is I would say it's one of the few comps in the game where, even though I wouldn't necessarily call like a Frost Valera strat a favored matchup for this, this is one of those comps where they can actually snap you on turn 2 and deny a bunch of your actions, and you can still win the game from there. I've had it happen multiple times where, you get snapped on 2 and you can actually still turn things around, which is pretty impressive because a lot of comps cannot do that. So for our backline, we are just running the nature backline. I've said it before, and I will say it again, the nature backline is pretty criminally underplayed relative to its performance, in my opinion. When we look at the graph a little bit later, we'll see there are actually very few comps with that 1,000+ game milestone that actually are running the nature backline, which really did surprise me. It does still show up, but is nowhere near as prevalent as it was, a month or 2 ago. Next up, speaking of nature, we have Nature Dragons, and I really love this build. You may have seen I posted a video on it pretty recently, and I had a very good run with it on stream. Just Nature Dragons is so much fun. I love the new dragon characters. They're really fun to play, and it's one of the few builds in Mercenaries that actually feels like a kind of proper control deck, which is pretty interesting. So we do have our Pearl of Yulon here to protect our other dragons, make it harder for them to die. Sinestra's always going to be rocking that mana brooch. It's just such an insane equipment, especially when you can also heal other dragons, protect them from a little bit of extra damage. It's just super duper powerful, and you're just going to be swapping off between these two a whole lot, as Sinestra does. But sometimes the nice thing about this is you can get in for that attack and get that bleed, and you get bleed 10 on a blue unit that's hitting them for 20 at the end of every turn. That definitely adds up and can be useful sometimes, even though it's not your main strategy with Sinestra. And then Longjin, probably in my opinion the best of the dragons. Here we actually have a different equipment on him for the other builds, but for this build you do want to be running the Kunlai Crystal, because being able to swap on turn 1 is very powerful. It might seem tempting to do the Among the Stars one to kind of give your dragons even more health, but I do think that being able to do this on turn 1 and get the mind games going instantly, even just the threat of them, if you're not going to do it on turn 1, is still really powerful, and the nature resistance doesn't hurt either, though that is not why we're really running this equipment. And then nature with it, right? Like I said, in the last comp, nature backline is really underrated and underplayed right now, I think. And we do have some synergy with Yulon. It's funny, the first time I read this, I just totally stopped reading after the nature damage part, did not notice the repeat for every other friendly dragon. So, with one tick of this, you can actually get up to 9 nature damage, and then you send in, any of these guys, you're dealing like a ton more damage just out of nowhere. So this comp's really fun, feels really powerful, and I would say it is probably the best version of dragons out there right now that I've seen and played against. Next up, we have another comp I covered relatively recently, the return of Rexar and his lovable beasts. So I've seen a few different versions of this build, trying out like some things with like the old King Crush variant. Personally, this is the one I kind of liked more. We are using Rexar with his Mama Bear claws to buff up our beasts. I did have someone inform me you do not need to place Rexar all the way on the left to get the buffs anymore. That was a thing at launch, but it seems they have patched it so you can order it differently, which is very nice. So I was glad to find that out. And this is one of the few builds that is making use of Nuzao. Nuzao is definitely a merc I think I underrated. It's still not 100% clear to me what the best equipment on him is. Currently, I'm running the Talisman of the Ox. However, I think there's a lot of merit in Helm of Nuzao because the additional health can sometimes be useful. And it also has, after an enemy attacks this merc, deal 5 damage to them, which is a pretty nice bonus on top of it. Bullish Belt is also actually a pretty strong equipment too, but I think it's just less strong as a lead, as we do not want this being on 2 cooldown, which is understandable. So for lead Nuzao, you don't really want this, but I have seen some builds with him on the bench that have made use of this, and it can be pretty strong in the right build. And we have King Mukla here. The nice thing about Mukla is he gives us more kind of beast fodder for this build and some protection versus stuff like the water elemental. With his Mukla's big brother equipment, just gives, you know, a nice little wall in the way, and it helps grow our Long Jin, who is actually running the Band of Bursting Novas equipment. This equipment is so insane, and it really helps enable a different strategy for Long Jin off of the bench, where you're just entering with +9 or sometimes even like +12 arcane damage. You get an extra spawn from Rexar, and it's incredibly powerful because you can buff that even more with Starfire Blessing, punish your opponent for trying to hit you. Then you can kind of use Among the Stars to make them hit you by accident, or you can just Celestial Breath a low HP red. And the nice thing about this is when the damage carries over, it actually applies the arcane damage buff again, so you can deal even more damage. I do not know if that's working as intended or not, but that is how it functions currently in the game, so might as well take advantage of it because it is very strong. And we do have Sinestra here to just kind of also give us that late game AoE and sustain. Longjin and Sinestra together can do some really degenerate things. I've seen it where I've like 2v3'd or 2v4'd with this comp before, just Longjin and Sinestra. They're just really powerful together, and they just feel really good to play. And then we have Cookie. Just mainly the reason Cookie is here is for that appetizers. We do just want as much health on our units as possible for this kind of build, and sometimes it is convenient getting the Cookie snipe off. Go Fish is also kind of nice as well. We do have Sinestra out at the end, as we can set it up right before her AoE goes off and get a free roll, whether that be some healing, some damage, extra stats, all that kind of good stuff. So it's been really cool seeing Rexar kind of make his way back into the fold of things, and I look forward to seeing how this beast build develops further over time. And we have the Chi-Ji Valera Fire build. I actually had a lot of fun playing this build, and it is one of the few Chi-Ji builds that does have some stats on HS Replay, which we'll take a little bit look at later, right before we go into the graph. Basically, what this build is trying to do is you're using your Chi-Ji to combo your Valera here. Blazing Band here really made Chi-Ji a much more powerful mercenary. However, one thing worth noting, there currently might be like a weird bug with Firestorm where it seems to be sometimes scaling additional damage off of this heal power more than it should when you keep stacking it up. I don't know the exact numbers on that, but it has been something people have noticed, so I do want to point that out in case that gets fixed or changed over time. That might impact Chi-Ji's performance a little. And we have Geddon here. Geddon is not set in stone as our lead, however he can be good with Chi-Ji for sure. But you can basically swap out Geddon for one of your reds, also either Thrall or Ragnaros. Definitely like doing Ragnaros if I'm expecting to get frozen, but you do want to try and save at least one of your reds on the bench for opposing Sinestras. And I know Diablo might look a little bit out of place here, but with you basically get him in on a switch in sometimes with Valera, so you get him sped up that way. He also acts as a fire combo enabler for Geddon sometimes. He's actually better in this comp than I initially thought, and I definitely think his inclusion was justified. And then Thrall, we just need that big red damage to kill opposing Sinestras at the end. Can also be a pretty sweet switch in with Valera once she is sped up. And then Rag, we just have Rag as our anti-freeze. Basically, we open with him a fair amount of the time for expecting Frost, and he helps shut down their freezing shenanigans. So this comp's really fun. It's definitely one of my favorite builds with GG, but I have to play more with it for sure before I can get a really good feeling of where it's positioned in the overall metagame. Then we have the Sparkbot comp. So I actually put up a video on this one yesterday for anyone who didn't see it. But currently the number one player on NA, Spark, is at about 30,000 MMR, high above everyone else because they have been botting nonstop. I think the bot's been going for over 3 days straight now, which is pretty ridiculous. I've seen multiple other users and players on Discord, Twitter, social media talk about it as well, running into the bot and all this stuff. But the comp they use is very solid, and I've played some games with it, and I was actually winning quite a fair amount of them. So this build opts to do a full Frost open with Localar, Jaina, and Varden. The big thing about these openers is that your opponent really has to choose, do they want to deal with Localar or do they want to deal with Jaina? And no matter what they decide, they're going to be given a hard time by whichever one they decide not to focus. So it's actually really difficult to kind of play around it because they just have two high value threats that are just, the scaling is insane, and then it makes insane damage output. And then the backline here, they're running Karen, Diablo, Sinestra. And this kind of makes sense, especially if, since it's a bot, they don't really care about if they go to ties because they're not wasting their own time. So I think Sinestra makes a lot more sense over something like Cookie or even another blue like Rogers or something. And you have to remember this is a bot comp, so basically it is trying to do the simplest actions possible because it is not reading and analyzing the game every time. It is basically just doing the same stuff over and over and over again. And the convenient thing about a comp like this is the targeting is not always very specific, so that's how they kind of are able to get away with it by using a bot. It's just they program whatever moves, and those are the ones it makes every game. So the bright side about that is if you do run into the bot and you beat it, whatever lines you chose will pretty much always beat the bot. But even though this is being used by a bot, it is still a legitimate comp. And after messing around with it a bit, it actually performed a lot better than I was expecting it to. And we have a new build here. This one is courtesy of Frankie. For anyone who might not know Frankie, he is definitely one of the best Mercenaries players I know, plays over on EU. And this one actually runs a Fire Elemental, funnily enough. Using your Fire Elemental and or Belinda to combo the Geddon. And it's an interesting build for sure. I tried it on stream the other day. I didn't have quite as much luck, but I think he said he had like an 8-0 record with this. So I definitely trust in that. Also, sometimes the NA and EU metas are a little bit different, so it's possible he was running into some different stuff that I was not facing. One example of that is I think dragons are much less popular on NA right now, whereas on EU, whenever I'm watching an EU stream, I do see them quite a bit more often. So maybe that has something to do with it. but basically you are running your Belinda, Valera, and Yedin off of the start. Just simple stuff here. Yedin has just been a rather powerful unit because of the rise of some reds becoming more popular again, and this allows you to speed up Yedin, get his Inferno off, and with the Belinda Elemental, you can actually apply more fire weakness to make the Yedin AoE even stronger, which is really cool. And then Chi-Ji can kind of come in off the bench to give some damage and sustain with the healing. Sinestra, we just all know how good Sinestra is as a bench unit by now. And then Thrall to kind of answer opposing Sinestras. So this is probably the comp I have the least overall experience with, but I did want to mention it because I do really like Chi-Ji, and I do think there are some rather cool comps with him, so I did want to showcase at least one more of those in this video. Alright, and then we have Shadow Sam. So I talked about Shadow Sam a little while ago, and how, the 2021 comp isn't really standing up in 2022. However, some people have still actually had success with the old Shadow Samuro build. That's actually not the one I'm showing here. The one that's actually the most popular is the CDC backline, which I very strongly disagree with for this build. As you can see, we have a different backline. We have Sinestra, Cookie, Localar, and I think it is a much, much stronger backline in the current meta. CDC is just, it was great, and there are still matchups where it can be good, but the big problem with it is you basically get soloed by Sinestra, and there's really not much you can do about it. And Sinestra is incredibly popular and prevalent in the metagame, so you really can't afford to be just like throwing games to that at the end of the game. But this version, it's a little bit different. So we have Vol'jin here, speeding up with his Ring of Haste. Then Natalie, I have Shadow for that bit of extra damage on the Shadow Beam. And Samuro just to, combo with them, just smack something down turn 1, get really big, and try and, leverage that to push an advantage. Makes sense. We have Burning Blade to make him even bigger on these attacks. Sinestra's just, independently good unit. Same kind of deal with Cookie, and the extra health is very helpful on our leading units especially. And then Localar is just, we need one good red, and Localar kind of fits the bill here. You probably could also use something like Thrall here. I do think Thrall and Localar are kind of tied for the best reds right now in terms of needing a good solution to Sinestra on the bench, and he just does a good job of filling in that position. And lastly here, we have a comp from our own Fighting Pit co-host Mullahu. This is his version of Frost Tyrion, and I've watched him play this deck a lot. We're actually probably going to do a co-op with it sometime in the near future, because I definitely want to learn more of it from him, as he has spent a lot of time with the deck, and I'm usually bouncing from comp to comp, trying all these new things. So it'll be good to kind of try out a deck with someone who I know has played it a lot, and has probably a better read on the overall play style than I would if I was just playing it for the first time. But a big reason why this comp is able to succeed is it leverages the buff from Tyrion here, the Ashbringer, and makes your Karen, Diablo, and Rogers big, and all of them greatly appreciate the additional stat bonus. Basically, the additional stats is a huge reason why you're able to beat Sinestra. Also, not having Cookie, having Rogers over Cookie has seemed to perform incredibly well. Rogers is just, Rogers scales up so quickly, and coming off the bench with an additional +8/+8 makes that scale even faster. Using the standard Death Rattle equipment on Barden, and Frigid Winds on Localar to kind of buff up himself, buff up the Barden damage, and punish opposing comps who are wanting to go very fast. And then, on the bench, we have Karen and Diablo. They go together like peas in a pod. Makes a lot of sense. And even though they have fallen out of favor a bit, I think the additional stat buff from Tyrion really does allow them to shine in the current meta a lot more than they were previously. And I really like his inclusion here of Rogers in the back. As much as we do all love Cookie and his additional health and combos and stuff, I think Rogers is just a much better pick in this meta. the reds in this meta, particularly like Lokalar, Thrall, Ragnaros, are very threatening units. And the fact that Rogers can come in at 19 attack, buff it up by another 10 attack, you can just like one shot or two shot a lot of these blues. You also have some combos there with Master Tactician to speed up the Diablo, or Varden for a cold snap. And then you have Firing Position, which can also just kind of punish them for going needlessly fast and deal a bunch of damage to everything that's already acted. So Rogers seems really, really good in this comp, and I've watched Malahu play quite a bit of it, and I feel confident it definitely has some good game in the meta. Just the one thing it has trouble with that is worth mentioning is it does seem to kind of fold pretty hard to dragon openers, but it seems to have game against just about everything else, which is a pretty good place to be. All right, so that is going to be it for, the initial decks I'm covering here. However, we do have a lot more to talk about. Before we get into the graph, though, I do want to mention as an aside that Chi-Ji comps basically did not end up making the cut for this graph. I did look at the HS replay stats on a few different levels and in terms of time frame as well. And even, narrowing down the time frame quite a bit, there just weren't a lot of Chi-Ji comps recorded, which kind of makes sense because the best Chi-Ji equipment was only made accessible to us, in the past week. So people are still doing a lot of experimenting. I do have some, there were only 3 comps that actually cleared the over 100 games played on HS Replay, so I will have that come up now. And unfortunately, as you can see, the win rates on these are not very good right now. Obviously, this is low sample size, so it doesn't say it all. And, this is a lot of people's, first time experimenting with Chi-Ji, so it's possible that they are misplaying as well. It's always a possibility. But if we do look at the comps here, there's this weird one with like a Zwen lead, which I don't agree with that one very much, and it has the lowest win rate, so I wasn't really too surprised by that. But it does have the highest games played, which did surprise me. The next one is actually one of the comps I showcased prior. It's the Chi-Ji, Valera, Geddon, Diablo, Ragnaros, Thrall comp. I really like this comp, but even here we're seeing it is just below that 50% win threshold. And there's another comp, the Malfurion Chi-Ji Mukla with the Sinistra Cookie Anacondra backline. I'm almost tempted to say you might want like Yu'lon over like Cookie in this backline, but I haven't played quite enough with Chi-Ji to be super certain. But even that one is just on the money at the 50% win rate. So all of these comps don't seem to be doing super crazy well, and we don't know for sure if Chi-Ji's third skill is bugged with the scaling or not. We haven't really gotten any confirmation on that. So it is possible if it is bugged, they could fix that, and then Chi-Ji might not be performing quite as well. So we are going to have to, wait and see a little bit longer on Chi-Ji. But I did want to, show these comps on here for anyone who was curious, as Chi-Ji builds didn't really make it into the graph this week because they just were not popular enough. So we're going to get into the graph here, and there are a lot of comps. So I looked at a bunch of different HS Replay data, but the one I decided to go with is we are looking at the top 10% of players, and this time frame is going to be from the patch date, the last patch, which was the 15th of February, and time of recording this, it is the 13th of March, so it is just under 1 month. So I think that's a good amount of time to see some developments. Obviously, it's only 2 weeks since our last Meta Monday. However, a lot more games have been played in that time, as more people have farmed up their stuff and are playing more PvP. So we're going to go through it here. Worth noting that if you see the BOF next to Varden, that is the frost damage scaling equipment, and the CA parentheses is for the death rattle equipment. these are important distinctions because sometimes the frost scaling is more important for builds, sometimes the death rattle is more important for builds, and Varden is really the only character that has such a wide variety of comps that they are played in where they're still switching up their item. So I did want to have that listed here. Looking at the graph though, the most popular comp right now is Grom, Belinda, Valera, with Varden with that frost scaling, Jaina, and Localar. This was pretty interesting, and this is kind of a flexible lead case scenario, as you don't always want to be leading Grom, so that could be a reason why Varden has that equipment still on the bench, because you can do the Belinda, Valera, Varden lead, which is very powerful. You can just, much like the earlier Frost comp, multi-opener comp I showed, you can open it in so many different ways, and that is part of what makes it very, very powerful. This one came in at 5,200 games, representing 11.2% of the metagame. And you're going to notice throughout this that there is a lot of Frost and a lot of Belinda, Valera, Varden. It is just a huge, huge part of the metagame right now, and I am hoping that in this next Mercs drop we can get hopefully some support for new archetypes that are not Frost, and even more hopefully a counter to kind of make some of these Frost strategies a little bit less dominant. Because as you can see on the list here, there are, I think 22? Yeah, 22 comps listed here. And out of those 22 comps, not to get too ahead of ourselves, but out of these 22 comps, 16 of them are Frost-based, which is pretty crazy. That's, like near 2/3 of all these comps here with over 1K games at higher ranks. So that's pretty crazy. But looking at the second most played comp here, we do have Belinda, Valera, Varden with the Death Rattle equipment, and Jaina, Sinestra, Localar. Again, just a good flexible Frost comp. 4,500 games, 9.7% of the metagame share. Dragons are making their way up though. Even though I did mention dragons are kind of underplayed, in my opinion, on NA right now, that does not mean nobody is playing them. They definitely are seeing a fair bit of play and a fair bit of success. Here we can see the Yulon Sinestra Long Jin opener. Seems to be doing pretty well. Worth noting that on this build, they're actually running the Dragon HP increase when you swap. I don't think that's the best for this build, but if you're not running into a lot of Frost comps, it might be better. If you are seeing a lot of Frost comps, you do want that swap on turn 1. And you have the Nature backline, which, as also I mentioned before, is kind of underplayed right now. We're going to see as we go through the comps here, there really aren't as many of these Nature backlines as there were in the past, even though I still think they're incredibly strong. For anyone who doesn't know what the Nature backline is, it is Malfurion, Cookie, and Brucon. This one comes in at 3,600 games and 7.7% of the metagame. And yet another Belinda, Valera, Varden start here. This one with the frost damage for Varden, and then a Sinestra, Localar, Cookie bench. So basically this is super duper similar to one of the comps at the top there. I mean, actually it is the basically the exact same comp. The only difference is you're swapping the equipment on Varden and you're swapping out Jaina for Cookie, but other than that, they're the exact same. This one comes in at 3,300 games and 7.1% of the metagame. Then we have another Grom build. However, this one is kind of the classic GBT, Grom, Valera, Thrall, Nature, kind of the premier aggro deck in Mercenaries, in my opinion. If you've been playing since the Valera launch, you've probably seen this a fair amount, and is definitely still fairly popular, at least here on NA. This one's coming in at 3,300 games as well, and 7.1% of the metagame. Then we have another Frost comp, tons of these here. Localar, Jaina, Varden with the Death Rattle. and surprisingly, a CDC bench, Karen Diablo Cookie. That is one that I really, I just think that CDC bench is kind of outdated right now, and though it can work in some matchups, Sinestra is way too prevalent, in my opinion, for it to be good. So I was actually really surprised to see Karen Diablo Cookie coming in at a comp that was this highly represented. However, it's possible some people just like sticking with that old bench, or they don't have some of the new stuff grinded up for different options. But the nature bench, even just that, could be a potentially better option here. But for this comp, it is coming in at 3,000 games and 6.5% of the metagame share. And we have Belinda, Valera, Varden with the Frost scaling, Jaina, Sinestra, and Localar. So this one is literally the same comp as the second most popular comp. However, it has about half the amount of games as it, and I think the reason for that is people have started using swappable openers a bit more, and because of that, using the frost scaling equipment on Barden isn't necessarily as good in those comps. This one is coming in at 2,300 games and just under 5% of the meta game. This next one really surprised me, especially if you happen to see the video I did on trying it out like a week or two ago. So Shadow Samuro is still kicking around, and this is like not the version I showed before we got into the graph. This is actually the classic Karen Diablo cookie bench. Like I said, there aren't a whole lot of Karen Diablo cookie benches running around. And I think in particular, this one, it is actually very wrong to run it on. As someone who tried a fair amount of this comp, I think CDC is just not the way to go with it. I was actually very surprised to see this showed up as high as it did with a positive win rate. And this one had about 1,900 games and 4.1% of the metagame share. But yeah, like I said, I would definitely recommend messing with the bench a bit because I don't think Karen Diablo Cookie shines in this current meta. Then we have Belinda Jaina Varden with the Death Rattle, Sinestra Localar Cookie. So we're noticing a trend here, right? Like the Frost core is kind of showing up in kind of everything. Sinestra is so independently powerful, she can just make her way into like any comp as a good bench green, and you don't really have to worry about it, and it kind of puts the onus on the opponent to have to deal with her, and if they don't have the tools to deal with her, they just roll over and die. And that is why CDC is kind of fallen out of the meta. But this one is coming in at 1,900 games with 4.1% of the metagame. Then we actually have our we have two Tyrion builds that actually made it in here to these 1,000 plus games. I still think Mulhouse might be actually the best one running around right now, but it did not have the sample size to make it onto the graph yet. But for this first one, we have Localar, Tyrion, and Varden with the Death Rattle. That makes a lot of sense. We've seen Localar kind of replace Jaina in these Frost Tyrion starts, which I think does make sense given the power of Localar, and it evens out your colors a little bit. This is actually the classic Frost Tyrion bench with a Karen Diablo Illidan bench. Again, they all really benefit from the Death Rattle on the Tyrion quite a lot, and it does give you a way to kind of answer opposing Sinestras, which is very important. This one comes in at 1,800 games and 3.9% of the metagame. Then we have another Belinda Valera Varden comp, surprise, surprise, with the Frost scaling. This one was actually a little surprising to me what they had on the bench. Or no, I guess that's the next one. I'm getting ahead of myself. This one on the bench has Jaina, Localar, and Rag. So this one actually isn't surprising at all. This is basically the version I showed you with the multi-opener that can swap things up a bunch. I still think this is one of the best Frost comps in the game. If you are opening with Bal, Valera, and Varden all the time. Have that frost scaling. If you're swapping up your opener, have the death rattle. And this one comes in at 1800 games as well, just under 4% of the meta. This next one is the one that was actually a little bit more interesting with what they did with the bench. The opener is the same, Belinda, Valera, Varden. Noticing a trend yet? Frost scaling on that, and then Jaina, Localar, and New Zhao. This one really took me by surprise. I have not seen New Zhao very much in comps that aren't beasts. So that was kind of cool, and I was actually very surprised to see him show up in a comp that has so many games. This one has 1800 games as well, and also comes in at just under 4% of the meta. We're getting near the end here, though. So we have the Belinda, Baron Geddon, Ragnaros open. This is like our one fire comp of the bunch, or like pure fire comp. Though worth noting, the Belinda Elemental is still the Ice Elemental just because it is so good. And then Sinestra, Localar, Cookie on the bench, coming at 1500 games and 3.2% of the meta. We have Localar, Jaina, Varden with the Death Rattle, Karen, Diablo, and Sinestra. So this one is actually the bot comp. This is the Spark bot comp that I was showcasing and talking about earlier. It definitely is pretty powerful. I was actually surprised it only had 1500 games, but it definitely felt really strong when I played it, and I mean, the bot seems to be winning with it too. So definitely not a bad choice there. Coming in at 1500 games, 3.2% of the meta. And we have our second Tyrion comp here, the Tyrion, Jaina, Varden Death Rattle with the Karen, Diablo, Illidan bench. This one, just, it's the same as the other Tyrion comp, except the only difference is they're swapping out Jaina, or they're swapping out Localar for Jaina. This is kind of like the classic Frost Tyrion build. I think it is probably worse. I think it really has a hard time with all these fast freezing elementals going around, especially with no rag or anything to counter it. So I think if you are going to choose a Tyrion build, either Mulhouse or the other one with Localar is probably a better choice. But this one's coming in at 1300 games and 2.8% of the meta. We do still have a few more to cover here. I'm going to run through them relatively quickly. But basically, the ones in this last range, I think the first two are like 1200 games. Then it goes down to 1000 for the last three, which is kind of our threshold here. But for the first one, we do have Belinda, Eudora, Valera, Localar, Vol'jin, Sylvanas. This is a really kind of weird comp. You don't see a lot of these triple green openers, but the kind of cool thing about it is you can actually still win against all these freeze elemental Valera openers a lot of the time. The only thing that could be kind of scary is if they have Grom. Grom can kind of mess up their plan a bit, but it is basically a flip in that matchup. Very interesting seeing Vol'jin on the bench. Especially Sylvanas on the bench too, but we do see Sylvanas a little bit more often in these Eudora comps, as they do have more ways to like generate and kind of bounce units and have multiple spawns to buff up the Sylvanas. I'm not really super sold on Sylvanas in this meta, but I did think it was cool to see that this comp was still getting played quite a bit. And like I mentioned, this one is, I believe, 1200 games and 2.6% of the meta. And then right after it, we have another Eudora comp, funnily enough. This one is Ragnaros Eudora Tyrion, of all things. Definitely did not expect to see the Tyrion in there, personally. And then the bench is kind of similar. Vol'jin, Thrall, Sylvanas. Kind of the similar core. You have Vol'jin there as kind of a fast blue revenge killer off the bench. Thrall is there as your answer to Sinestra, and Sylvanas just gets big off of the Eudora summons and presumably the Tyrion Death Rattle, which is pretty cool. I know a few different people who have had success with like the Rag Eudora openers. However, it's one I haven't tried too much myself, so I'll have to give it a proper shot to see how it goes, but I did see people were having some success with it, and this one is coming in, I believe, also at 1,200 games and 2.6% of the meta. And now we have Localar Jaina Varden with the Death Rattle, Belinda Sinestra Alex Straza. This one really took me off guard. Was very surprised to see Alex kind of make it in here. I don't know if that's because they were going for some dragon synergy with Sinestra. Personally, I haven't seen a lot of Alex, so I don't really know how to judge this build too much. However, this one is coming in at the 1,000 games mark and represents about 2.2% of the meta. And we have another Grom build, Grom Belinda Valera, Varden Jaina Localar, Varden with the Rattle. This, I think Grom has just been a very, very powerful answer to a lot of these Frost comps in a lot of ways, shutting down the Elemental, messing up the Valera combo and some of these GG builds, or really any time you see Valera come out and there's only one fast unit to combo with her, Grom gets like an insane amount of value. Also, quite a few amount of greens running around right now in the metagame, so Grom is just kind of a naturally one of the best reds to kind of help deal with that. And we just have a very strong Frost core here. I mean, the whole bench is Frost, so you can open up differently if you so desire. And it's just powerful. It's a really good comp, coming in at 1,000 games and 2.2% of the meta. Second to last comp here, the Localar Jaina Varden with the Death Rattle, so a Frost opener, and Nature Bench. So if you may have noticed, there are not a lot of Nature Bench comps on here. I think there are like 3 or 4 total. Nature has really just taken a hit in terms of popularity, which has really surprised me because I don't think Nature is particularly bad as a backbench. If anything, I think it's actually rather good, especially against so much Sinestra running around, as if you have the full Nature bench out, you can basically outscale and outdamage Sinestra. She can't kill them effectively if you can pick off their other units. So that was actually kind of surprising for me to see. This one is coming in again at 2.2% of the meta with 1,000 games. And last but not least, we have a Belinda Valera Varden Death Rattle with a Jaina Localar Rag bench. This, I was actually really surprised to see this one came in so much lower than its kind of counterpart with, the Frost scaling. But I guess people really enjoy the Frost scaling version or just having a lot more success with it, so they're just playing it more. But I do personally like this version of the build, and I do think the flexibility gives you a lot of utility. However, this one is only coming in at 1,000 games and 2.2% of the meta. So there are a lot of comps here, but like I mentioned, I think it's 16 out of the 22 comps here are Frost based. That is insane. I was hoping that we would see a bit more in the way of counters to Frost, and I think just the sheer power of the units that Frost has is really just pushing them over the edge a bit, to where there's no reason not to throw Frost in almost every comp. And I think that will change eventually. I do think we're going to be getting some new mercs soon, and I'm hopeful we either get a counter Frost strategy or we get just some more powerful support for other archetypes to diversify play a little bit and make it so Frost isn't always the right choice in so many of these comps. But only time will tell if that is going to happen. That is going to wrap it up for this video, though. If you enjoyed it, do remember to like and subscribe, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.